The entire Western gaming landscape has been a complete mess in recent years. And honestly, the way modern titles are being produced is far more dystopian than I ever imagined. The deeper I dug into it this week, the more I found myself wishing I'd never uncovered the truth at all. The path to folly is paved with good intentions, and nowhere is that folly more glaring than in the way gaming has shifted its focus. What was once a medium defined by larger-than-life heroes, unrestrained imagination and the joy of pure escapism now so often congratulates itself on delivering a broader range of identities and supposedly realistic characters, a shift born, at least on the surface, from the noble desire to reflect the diversity of the real world better. The result has been a cultural fault line. Some see troubling patterns everywhere they look, convinced that creative priorities have been sacrificed on the altar of ideology, while others dismiss such concerns as bad faith nitpicking or reactionary attempts to invent problems that don't exist. But what if I were to tell you that the real source of this creative drift isn't the developers themselves, or the publishers pulling the strings, or even the faceless investment firms that bankroll them, nor is it the usual suspects like Sweet Baby Inc., who have become the internet's favourite scapegoat? No, the truth runs far deeper than that. Behind the industry's most contentious design choices lies a group whose influence is so deeply woven into the fabric of modern game development that its fingerprints are on almost every major release, even if, until now, you've never heard its name. I am Lady Decade, and if you like your gaming content spicy, then hit that subscribe button, because today we're going to be talking about a topic that, to my knowledge, hasn't really been explored on YouTube before. So sit back and relax, and let's get into it. If there's one thing that truly grinds my gears about the modern gaming industry, it's just how eye-wateringly expensive it's become. But fear not, gaming doesn't have to be a luxury hobby reserved only for those with bottomless wallets. Through this channel, you can grab 38% off the critically acclaimed Silent Hill F, 30% off Borderlands 4, and huge savings on titles like Stellar Blade, Final Fantasy Tactics, Black Myth Wukong, and countless more. Use my links below to unlock discounts on thousands of games. Happy shopping and happy viewing. Now, the name Geena Davis might conjure up images of Hollywood, Thelma and Louise, Cutthroat Island, even Beetlejuice, rather than game design, yet the institute she founded over 20 years ago now sits at the very heart of how this industry thinks about itself. Most players have no idea it even exists, yet its research, reports and recommendations echo in boardrooms and production meetings from Montreal to Tokyo. And while online debates tend to obsess over the most visible villains, companies like Sweet Baby Inc., founded in 2018, and now one of the most frequently cited diversity consultancies in gaming are, in truth, only the surface layer of a much larger system. Their work may shape how individual games are written, but the framework they're implementing was laid down long before they ever entered the picture. If we want to understand why so many blockbuster games feel eerily alike, why their narratives and characters so often seem to roll off the same ideological assembly line, we have to stop mistaking the symptom for the disease, because behind the scenes, beyond the controversies and the comment section outrage, lies a far more powerful architect of change. Its influence is woven so deeply into the fabric of this industry that most people never even realise it's there. I'm talking about the Geena Davis Institute on Gender in Media. Often referred to simply as GDI, the group was founded in 2004 with a mission that, on the surface, few could argue with: to study representation in film, television and games, and to use that data to encourage more authentic portrayals of women and marginalised groups. It was born out of a simple observation that Davis herself made as a parent, that the stories children consumed were still overwhelmingly populated by male characters, and that the few female roles they did encounter often reinforced narrow, outdated stereotypes. The idea was straightforward. If media could present girls and women in a broader range of roles, ambitions and contexts, those portrayals could shape how real people saw themselves and what they believed was possible. If she can see it, she can be it. became the organisation's unofficial motto, a soundbite that neatly encapsulated the philosophy driving its early work. In its first few years, the Institute functioned much like any other research-focused advocacy group. It published studies on gender ratios in children's programming, measured how often female characters spoke compared to their male counterparts, and highlighted the limited roles available to women across entertainment media. It hosted conferences, presented its findings to industry leaders, and built a reputation as an authoritative voice on representation. Crucially, this early work was descriptive rather than prescriptive. The goal was to hold up a mirror to the industry and let the numbers speak for themselves, but over time, that approach began to shift, and with it, the Institute's ambitions grew. The Institute's relationship with the entertainment industry deepened over time, and its role shifted from that of an observer to something closer to a partner and, eventually, a guide. By the mid-2010s, GDI was no longer content to publish research and hope studios might act on it simply. It began actively embedding itself within the development process itself. Its researchers didn't just count who appeared on screen, they started advising companies such as Disney, Google, Microsoft and Warner Brothers on how to change those numbers. What had once been academic studies evolved into practical toolkits. Reports became corporate workshops, and conferences transformed into formalised advisory partnerships with some of the biggest names in film, television and gaming. Before long, the Geena Davis Institute wasn't merely measuring representation, it was actively shaping it. In essence, this was the start of a coordinated push to redefine creative decision-making itself. Where the early message had been, consider who's missing, the new directive became, here's how you must include them. That shift was crystallised in the Inclusive Game Design Playbook. That is an actual document, developed with support from major publishers and positioned not as a set of polite suggestions, but as a formal development framework. What were once recommendations hardened into best practices, and those best practices soon found their way into studio guidelines, corporate diversity strategies, and even contractual clauses. Internal advisory councils, such as those at Lego, Activision Blizzard, and Warner Brothers Discovery, were established to oversee compliance with these standards, and the Institute's language, such as marginalised perspectives should be considered at the conception stage, became part of the industry's shared vocabulary. No longer was GDI's influence just shaping individual creative decisions, it was being woven directly into the DNA of the process. Its principles became part of the standard operating procedure for how stories, including video games, were conceived, written and brought to life. What had started as advocacy was, by this stage, increasingly indistinguishable from governance. By the time anyone outside the industry began to even notice, the Geena Davis Institute was no longer simply a research group campaigning for better representation. It had become something far larger, a central node in the cultural machinery of modern entertainment, one quietly shaping stories that would define an entire generation of media, and it was a shift that would quietly reshape the very foundations of the gaming landscape, with consequences the industry is still grappling with today. Right, I don't know about you, but learning so much of the truth behind modern games is sometimes a little bit on the depressing side. But don't worry, because I have an antidote for you. For those of you who spend more time daydreaming about the good old days of gaming than actually playing anything released in the last 5 years, I've got you covered. I've just launched a brand new retro gaming history channel that gives you a much needed holiday from the endless conveyor belt of AAA slop clogging up your feeds. It's called Lady Arcade, and you can find it via the pinned comment below. So far, I've already served up a love letter to the Sega Saturn. Yes, it's still brilliant in 2025, and even mounted a full-blown defence of the cursed, misunderstood 3DO. So if you'd rather escape the modern drudgery and bask in the glory of gaming's past, hit subscribe and join me there. Let's make gaming fun again. Anyway, back to the horrifying truth. Today, the Institute's recommendations are no longer presented as suggestions, they are treated as fundamental steps in the development process. The very first boxes that must be ticked before a single line of code is written or a single character is designed. At the heart of this shift lies what the playbook calls Key 1. craft your approach, a process built around a concept borrowed from the social sciences, reflexivity. In practice, reflexivity means that developers are expected to pause and interrogate who they are before they even begin their work. The inclusive game design playbook explicitly instructs writers, artists, and narrative designers to map out their personal identity, to consider their age, race, gender, sexuality, religion, or spiritual beliefs, disability status, socioeconomic background, education level, nationality, body size, and even the languages they speak, and to reflect on how those factors shape their assumptions about the world and the stories they are about to tell. The playbook even provides worksheets and identity mapping charts, inviting creators to document how each element of their background influences their world view. Our lived experiences influence how we frame narratives, it notes, and we must be conscious of the perspectives we centre and the biases we reproduce. In other words, the first stage of game development is no longer about brainstorming characters or imagining worlds, it's about interrogating the storyteller. What's more troubling is that this self-audit doesn't end with the individual, it extends directly into the story itself. Developers are instructed to scrutinise every narrative decision with questions that would once have belonged in a sociology seminar rather than a design meeting. Who benefits from this story? Who is harmed by it? Whose perspective is being centred and whose is being excluded? Does this narrative challenge inequality, or does it unconsciously reinforce it? Are structural forces from race and class to gender and colonialism visible within the world building, and if not, why? These are not posed as idle philosophical musings, they are framed as essential creative checks, the answers to which shape everything that follows. The result is that the opening act of game design, once most imaginative and free-flowing part of the entire process, has been reframed as an exercise in identity deconstruction and ideological positioning. Before a story can even exist, those telling it must first account for themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, this is how Western games are now made. What's most striking about this shift is how fundamentally it redefines the purpose of storytelling itself. Now, before a game can even begin to take shape, it must first pass through an ideological audit designed to ensure that the finished work aligns with a specific set of social and cultural priorities. Creativity becomes conditional, no longer judged solely by its quality, originality, or entertainment value, but by its compliance with an approved worldview. By making reflexivity a non-negotiable starting point, the Geena Davis Institute doesn't just influence what stories are told, it dictates who feels qualified to tell them and on what terms those stories are allowed to exist. And that is what makes all of this so deeply unsettling. When the creative process is no longer driven by inspiration but instead policed by ideological gatekeeping, it doesn't just narrow the kinds of stories that get told, it narrows the people who feel welcome to tell them. Curiosity is replaced with caution, experimentation gives way to self-censorship. What should be a boundless, unpredictable medium becomes one hemmed in by invisible boundaries. The result is a landscape where art is no longer free to surprise, provoke, or even fail on its own terms. It must first be approved, sanitized, and permitted before it's ever allowed to exist. If reflexivity is the seeds planted at the start of development, then key to craft stories is where that seed begins to bloom, and it's here that the Institute's influence becomes impossible to mistake for anything other than ideological. Once upon a time, the purpose of a narrative framework was simple: to serve the story. Writers instinctively reached for structures like Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, not because of some political agenda, but because they understood the timeless appeal of a protagonist overcoming adversity, growing through hardship, and achieving transformation. It was a creative skeleton sturdy enough to support everything from ancient mythology to Star Wars, a narrative tool rather than a cultural statement. The playbook, however, frames that entire tradition very differently. These foundational storytelling models are now described as tired, patriarchal and masculine coded, relics of a worldview in which male heroes overwhelmingly embody agency, ambition and power. Classic devices, the damsel in distress, the frigid woman whose death motivates a man's revenge, the lone saviour narrative, the colonialist outsider brings civilization plot are presented not merely as outdated cliches but as inherently exclusionary. Their continued use, the Institute argues, reinforces structural inequality by centering male experience, erasing marginalised voices and reducing female characters to plot devices or emotional props. The proposed solution isn't to reinterpret or modernise these classic frameworks, it's to abandon them altogether. The Inclusive Game Design Playbook isn't a suggestion manual gathering dust on a shelf, it's now a de facto industry standard, one that platform holders, publishers and trade associations are actively enforcing across every stage of development. Microsoft's Gaming for Everyone initiative, for example, integrates GDI principles directly into its first-party development standards. Under Principal Project Manager Benjamin Williams, compliance is more than encouraged, it's a contractual requirement. Sony has followed a similar path. Internal diversity councils now require playbook-aligned checkpoints at key milestones if projects are unable to proceed until they meet those standards. And the same is true on the publishing side. At Activision Blizzard, the Inclusive Game Design Council, led by Adrian Leder, enforces the playbook across all franchise teams and ties milestone payments to inclusivity audits. Ubisoft goes even further. Its Diversity Task Force, overseen by Rashi Seeker, mandates automated bias analysis directly in the Unity and Unreal development pipelines. Even LEGO has built the playbook into its creative DNA, and Arafati's digital consumer engagement division now trains all narrative writers on the playbook's 5 Ps framework as part of standard onboarding. This pressure doesn't just come from individual companies. Industry bodies like UK Interactive Entertainment have adopted the playbook as national best practice through partnerships with Women in Games International and the Oak Foundation, warning member studios that failure to certify compliance could mean reduced access to funding and trade initiatives. It's no longer about whether these studios want to follow these principles. They must, or risk being locked out of publishing deals, platform partnerships, and even industry associations altogether. It's beyond restrictive for creatives. All of this stems from a single source, GDI's 2023 white paper, Changing the Narrative: Why Representation in Video Games Matters. This document lays the theoretical groundwork for the entire playbook and introduces the key concepts that now underpin mainstream narrative design. It coins the term counter-narrative, defining it as a story framework that deliberately challenges dominant heroic structures by centering marginalised voices and perspectives. It also introduces the 5 Ps framework: prominence, power, personality, proficiency, and profession, which functions as a set of mandatory character design metrics. Every major character is now scored against these criteria to ensure balanced demographic distribution across all 5 dimensions. If you were ever wondering why all of a sudden all of the female protagonists in gaming are objectively ugly, well, here's your concrete answer. The white paper even extends beyond story structure to gameplay itself, prescribing mechanics that reward cooperation, empathy and creativity over domination and aggression. It calls on developers to design gameplay that actively challenges rigid masculinity and to eliminate mechanics that reinforce domination of female characters. These guidelines are not treated as optional, they are increasingly embedded into internal design documents, corporate diversity policies, and even milestone reviews. Of course, understanding how this ideology took hold means following the money. GDI's rise from a small advocacy group to one of the most influential forces in media was made possible by a web of corporate and philanthropic funding. A $1.2 million global impact award from Google in 2012 helped create GDIQ, the spell check for bias machine learning tool now licensed by Disney, NBC Universal and Warner Brothers to flag representational imbalances in scripts before production. A $75,000 grant from the Nielsen Foundation in 2024 underwrote GDI's annual representation reports and global symposiums, while corporate partnerships with Disney, Microsoft and Warner Brothers provided access to proprietary development data, strengthening the GDIQ algorithm and ensuring studios remained dependent on it. These funders have clear incentives. As the Global Situation Room's Reputation Risk Index warns, backtracking on DEI commitments can trigger severe backlash from investors, consumers and employees. By embedding GDI's frameworks into their development pipelines, companies gain reputational insulation, measurable DEI metrics to present to shareholders, and the ability to demonstrate social impact without relinquishing control of the narrative. Philanthropic donors like the Oak Foundation and Women in Games International, meanwhile, see the Institute as a lever for systemic cultural change, a way to use data to break barriers, challenge norms, and bridge gaps in representation. And if the Geena Davis Institute's first two keys reshape how stories are conceived and constructed, their influence doesn't stop when the credits roll. In fact, it goes much deeper. The organisation's research isn't confined to what appears on screen, it extends to how those stories shape the people who consume them. In GDI's worldview, representation isn't merely about fairness or visibility, it's a behavioural lever, a tool to influence how players think, feel and act. And once you understand that this is how they view the medium, the true scale of their ambitions and the power they now wield becomes far clearer. Central to this worldview is something called the Proteus effect, a concept drawn from social psychology that GDI highlights repeatedly in its reports. The theory suggests that players unconsciously adjust their behaviour to match the traits of the avatars they inhabit. In other words, who you play as subtly shapes who you become, at least for the duration of the experience. Classic studies cited by GDI show, for example, that players controlling taller avatars tend to become more assertive in subsequent real-world negotiations, while those embodying more attractive characters demonstrate increased confidence and sociability. Other experiments have observed heightened cooperation in multiplayer environments when players inhabit avatars coded as empathetic or community-oriented. GDI uses findings like these to argue that video games are not simply reflections of society, they are active instruments of social conditioning. Representation in this view isn't descriptive, it's prescriptive. The Institute's reports go even further, drawing direct links between specific types of representation and measurable psychological outcomes. Research cited in its 2023 gaming report, for instance, associates long-term exposure to sexualized female avatars with increased tolerance for harassment, greater acceptance of rape myths, and reduced empathy for victims of sexual violence. Other studies note that repeated exposure to hypermasculine male protagonists, often described by teenage players as physically powerful, dominant, violent, mean and cocky, can reinforce sexist attitudes, foster feelings of entitlement and even increase willingness to excuse aggressive behaviour. GDI treats these correlations not just as evidence that choices matter, but crucially as justification for intervening in those choices. The impact, according to GDI, is not confined to male players. Its reports highlight evidence that female players frequently internalise the objectification they encounter in games. This phenomenon, known as self-objectification, the tendency to view oneself through the imagined gaze of others, has been repeatedly linked in academic literature to lowered self-esteem, body dissatisfaction, depression and even disordered eating. One survey conducted in partnership with Dove and Women in Games involved girls and young women aged 14 to 24, found that more than 1 in 3 reported diminished confidence due to the narrow range of body types presented in games. These effects, GDI argues, reach far beyond the screen, shaping how players perceive themselves long after they've put the controller down. And the behavioural framing doesn't stop with character design. design. GDI's research claims that even gameplay mechanics, from how players cooperate to how they compete, can reinforce or challenge existing power structures. A mechanic that rewards domination and conquest, for example, is described as reinforcing masculine-coded aggression, while systems that prioritise empathy or collective action are praised for fostering pro-social behaviour. The underlying message is clear: if games can influence how people behave, then they can also be designed to encourage or discourage certain types of behaviour. It's here that the true nature of the Institute's project becomes most visible. What began as a campaign for better representation is now framed as an opportunity to shape the beliefs, attitudes and even self-perceptions of the people who play these games. At this stage, the conversation has shifted entirely. It's no longer about fairness or visibility, it's about influence. And if, as GDI's own research argues, games have the power to shape how people think and act, then those who shape the games wield extraordinary cultural power, not just over the stories we consume, but over the society we inhabit. By this stage, it should be clear that the Geena Davis Institute's work extends far beyond suggesting story tweaks or encouraging more thoughtful character design. The real power of its framework lies not in the ideas themselves, but in how deeply those ideas have been absorbed into the machinery of the games industry. Studios are no longer simply encouraged to follow the playbook, they are increasingly structured around it. This is the point at which representation stops being an aspiration and becomes a condition of doing business. One of the clearest examples of this shift is the rise of sensitivity readers and external consultants as mandatory checkpoints within the development pipeline. These specialists, often drawn from advocacy organisations or identity-focused consultancies, are brought in not merely to provide feedback but to sign off on key creative decisions. Their notes can influence everything from dialogue and character arcs to costume design and marketing language, and their approval is frequently required before a project is allowed to proceed. In some publisher contracts, a diversity review now appears alongside technical compliance and age ratings as a standard pre-release requirement. What might once have been purely artistic choices are now subject to ideological review. Technology too has been enlisted to enforce this new orthodoxy, including the Geena Davis Institute's own GDIQ, Geena Davis Inclusion Quotient system, developed in partnership with Google, which I briefly mentioned earlier but was yet to provide much context on. GDI describes it as a kind of spell check for bias. Using machine learning, it analyses scripts, story documents and even cutscene footage for representational imbalances, sometimes before the writing process is even complete. The tool can automatically measure screen time, dialogue share, speaking role distribution by gender and ethnicity, LGBTQIA+ visibility, and disability representation, flagging areas where improvement is recommended. GDIQ is now being adapted for use in games, inserting algorithmic scrutiny into the creative process long before players ever see a finished product. The Institute's influence also extends to the strategic level. Advisory councils shaped by GDI's research now operate within major publishers, helping to set company-wide policies on content, hiring, and development priorities. These are not passive committees, they sit within corporate decision-making structures with real authority over the direction of franchises. At the same time, internship schemes, mentorship programs and recruitment pipelines built around GDI's principles ensure that diversity isn't just a creative consideration, it becomes a workforce expectation. New hires are often required to demonstrate experience with inclusive design or an understanding of identity-centered development philosophies. In this way, the playbook doesn't merely shape the products that studios make, it shapes the people who make them. Even once a game enters testing, the ideological checks do not stop. Playtesting sessions and player surveys no longer focus solely on gameplay balance or technical polish, they now routinely include metrics for so-called inclusivity outcomes. These measure how well players feel represented, whether the narrative challenges stereotypes, and whether the experience aligns with contemporary social expectations. The results can trigger additional changes before launch and, in some cases, are even reported to stakeholders as evidence of a studio's social responsibility commitments. In certain instances, meeting these inclusivity benchmarks is now directly tied to milestone payments from publishers or platform holders, effectively turning what were once optional surveys into de facto requirements for project funding. At this point, it becomes difficult to argue that the playbook is merely a guide. It functions far more like a rule book, one that developers are expected to follow if they wish to secure funding, maintain partnerships, or avoid reputational damage. Compliance is rarely enforced through formal regulation, but it doesn't need to be. Once these standards are written into contracts, woven into corporate policy and normalised across the industry, they exert pressure by their very existence. Studios no longer follow the playbook because they want to, they follow it because they have to. And that, more than anything else, is why AAA gaming is becoming increasingly homogenised. The boundaries of creativity are being defined long before a single idea reaches the screen. The ideological transformation of the games industry might begin with good intentions and lofty language, but by the time it reaches the production floor, it carries a very real price tag. Creative freedom isn't the only thing constrained by this new orthodoxy. So too are budgets, schedules, and the viability of entire studios. What started as a philosophical shift has become an economic reality, reshaping the industry just as profoundly as any narrative or design change. The most immediate impact is on time. Development cycles that once averaged 4 years are now frequently stretched to 6, 7, or 8. Every new review gate, every sensitivity pass, consultant consultation, representation audit, and inclusivity playtest adds weeks or months onto a project's schedule. A single narrative overhaul triggered by negative inclusivity feedback can result in expensive rewrites, re-recorded dialogue, and reworked assets, setting production back by entire quarters. Internal surveys cited in the Inclusive Game Design Playbook note that inclusivity testing alone can extend development timelines by 6 to 12 months. These delays compound across large studios managing multiple projects, creating production pipelines that move more slowly, more cautiously, and with far less room for creative risk. The costs rise accordingly. Sensitivity readers typically charge between $5,000 and $15,000 per review, while cultural consultants can command anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000 per engagement. Mandatory inclusivity audits often cost tens of thousands more, and each additional playtesting phase can add hundreds of thousands to a project's overall budget. Even the integration of third-party tools like GDIQ, often licensed as proprietary software, represents an ongoing expense. For major AAA publishers, these costs can be absorbed as the price of doing business, but for smaller independent studios, they are nothing short of catastrophic. Many simply cannot afford to comply, and as a result, they find themselves shut out of publishing deals, platform curation programs, or grant opportunities that require adherence to these standards. Some are forced to close their doors entirely, unable to shoulder the burden of an industry that now demands ideological vetting as part of the creative process. Even worse, even among those who do survive, the cumulative effect is unmistakable. Projects balloon in size and scope, with budgets spiralling into the hundreds of millions as studios scramble to build safe products that satisfy every conceivable demand. Risk aversion becomes the default mode of operation. Why experiment with unusual mechanics or bold new worlds when one controversial decision could trigger costly rewrites, threaten platform partnerships, or jeopardize funding altogether? The inevitable result is a wave of games that feel homogenized, designed not for artistic impact or gameplay innovation, but for compliance. And in an industry built on creativity, there may be no greater cost than that. The The consequences are visible everywhere. We see them in the high-profile cancellation of games that spend years languishing in development hell before being quietly shelved. We see them in the wave of studio closures that follow each new economic downturn, often hitting the smallest and most inventive teams the hardest. And we see them in the cautious sameness of so many blockbuster releases, projects that cost more, take longer, and ultimately say less, all because the creative process has been encumbered by layer upon layer of ideological oversight. In theory, this is all supposed to make games better, more representation, more inclusive, more reflective of the world around us, but in practice, it has made them slower, more expensive, and more timid. And in a medium that once thrived on imagination, experimentation, and surprise, that might be the greatest cost of all. Let's be clear, if there's one thing that gamers are never short of, it's outrage, and in recent years much of that outrage has found a convenient target. Whenever a new release ships with dialogue that sounds like it was written by a corporate HR department, or a beloved franchise returns warped beyond recognition by the latest round of ideological tinkering, it doesn't take long for comment sections and message boards to start pointing fingers. And the name that almost always surfaces is Sweet Baby Inc., a consultancy whose credits have appeared on a growing list of high-profile titles and whose reputation for diversity work has made it the lightning rod for fan frustration, and to some extent, that anger is understandable. Sweet Baby Inc. and similar firms do shape how characters are written, how stories are told, and how studios approach sensitive subjects. They are often brought in during crucial stages of development, wield significant influence over the finished product, and are sometimes even written into publisher contracts. But to focus solely on them is to misunderstand how the system actually works, and to miss the far bigger story unfolding behind the scenes. Sweet Baby Inc. was founded in 2018, more than half a decade after the Geena Davis Institute had already embedded itself deep into the entertainment industry's infrastructure. By the time consultancies like Sweet Baby entered the picture, the ideological blueprint was already in place. They are not the architects of this new creative orthodoxy, they are the enforcers. The ideas they implement, the frameworks they reference, the language they use, and the ideological priorities they promote all originate elsewhere. They come from organisations like the Geena Davis Institute, which writes the rule book that the consultancies are then hired to enforce. Those consultancies translate that rulebook into practice. They sit in writers' rooms, mark up scripts, and push for changes that align with the standards they've been given. They conduct narrative audits, provide sensitivity feedback on everything from character motivations to costume design, and advise on marketing language to ensure public reception aligns with industry expectations. And finally, the studios themselves, eager to maintain publisher relationships, avoid reputational risk, or simply meet evolving industry norms, become the compliers, bending their creative decisions to fit the approved template. It's a three-tier system, you see: architect, enforcer, complier. At the top sits the architects, organisations like GDI, setting the ideological agenda and defining the principles that shape the modern development process. In the middle are the enforcers, the consultancies whose names players recognise, tasked with ensuring that the agenda is carried out. And at the bottom are the studios themselves, who bear the cost and shoulder the blame, but ultimately have little room to manoeuvre. The problem is that most of the discourse never looks beyond what's visible on the surface. It's easier, after all, to page at the name you see in the credits than at the anonymous policy documents, research toolkits, and playbooks that never make it into the public eye. And as long as the conversation stops there, nothing changes. The true source of this cultural shift will remain unchallenged, and the forces reshaping games from the inside out will continue to do so quietly, systematically, and largely unnoticed. The effects of this system aren't just theoretical. They're not confined to dry policy documents or buried away in corporate handbooks. They are playing out right now in the games we buy, the headlines that we're reading, and the studios that have shut their doors. And if you know what to look for, you can trace the fingerprints of this new creative orthodoxy across some of the industry's most spectacular recent failures. Take Redfall, for example, a game that on paper should have been a sure thing. Developed by Arcane Austin, one of the most respected studios in the business, marketed as a flagship Xbox exclusive, and given a generous development window, it had all the ingredients for major success, but instead what players got was a directionless, anemic shooter that stumbled out of the gate and never recovered. Development dragged on well past its original timeline, narrative goals shifted repeatedly, and internal reports described a team paralysed by competing priorities and constantly changing direction. Several developers later told Bloomberg that the project's vision was never clear, with mechanics, tone and story repeatedly reworked to satisfy evolving internal mandates. The result was a product that felt less like a cohesive creative vision and more like a checklist of representational goals assembled under duress, a Frankenstein's monster of box-ticking compromises. Or consider Concord, Sony's reportedly $200 million live service gamble, which collapsed almost the instant it was unveiled. Everything about the project screamed committee thinking. The art direction was bland, the mechanics derivative, and the tone felt as though it had been algorithmically assembled to satisfy a marketing brief rather than a creative vision. Even before launch, promotional materials leaned heavily on language about diverse teams, authentic representation, and social storytelling, but said remarkably little about how the game would actually play. And players weren't fooled. They saw a title that seemed to prioritise messaging over mechanics and social positioning over substance, and they stayed away in droves. Within weeks of release, Concord was already being discussed less as a product and more as a cautionary tale about what happens when ideology outweighs design. Then there's Dustborn, a smaller but equally revealing example. Marketed as a narrative-driven adventure about resistance, identity, and the power of words, Dustborn generated plenty of buzz among journalists and industry insiders before launch. But when it finally arrived, the response was muted at best. Critics and players alike noted that the gameplay was thin, the pacing uneven, and the mechanics underdeveloped, all symptoms of a project that had poured more effort into delivering a message than into delivering an experience. Across all three of these titles, the same patterns repeat. Budgets swell as projects are repeatedly retooled to meet shifting inclusion and representation targets. Teams fracture and morale collapses under the weight of constant revisions and ideological oversight. Stories and mechanics are subordinated into messaging, leaving behind games that feel hollow, compromised, or simply unfinished. And most damning of all, the audiences these projects were designed to win over respond with indifference or worse, outright rejection. This is the human cost of the playbook mindset in practice. It's not just the billions of dollars lost or the studios that shut their doors, it's the creative energy squandered, the talent wasted, and the opportunities missed because games are no longer being built first and foremost to entertain. They are being built to conform, and in doing so, they are losing the very spark that once made this medium thrive. It's easy to feel disillusioned when surveying the wreckage left behind by games that collapsed under the weight of their own messaging, but to understand just how unnecessary that collapse is, we need to look at the titles that succeeded, often spectacularly, by doing the exact opposite. Take Black Myth Wukong, a game that defied almost every prevailing rule of modern Western development and became a global sensation precisely because of it. Within just 4 days of launch, Wukong sold over 10 million copies worldwide, dominated streaming charts on Twitch and Bilibili, and ignited conversations about what big-budget projects could look like when they are built on creative vision rather than external expectations. Or consider Elden Ring, one of the most successful and beloved games of the past decade. It has sold more than 25 million copies globally, swept major awards including Game of the Year at the Game Awards, and built a passionate, diverse fan base, all without ever pausing to lecture its audience. The same is true in the indie space, where creativity often flourishes precisely because it is unconstrained. Smaller studios lacking the resources for endless sensitivity passes or ideological audits are forced to focus on what truly matters: innovative mechanics, unique perspectives, and heartfelt storytelling. And these projects prove a crucial truth: diversity does not need to be engineered into a game. When creativity leads and ideology follows, then success happens naturally. The debate has never truly been about diversity versus no diversity. It's about authentic creativity versus engineered messaging, about whether games should reflect the organic complexity of the people who make them and the worlds they inhabit, or whether they should be built according to a pre-approved cultural blueprint. So much of the current conversation around modern gaming never gets beyond the surface. We argue over the most visible names in the credits, we mock the most ham-fisted dialogue, and we rage at the latest clumsy attempt to turn a beloved franchise into a sermon. But if we genuinely care about the future of this medium, if we want games to be bold and creative and surprising again, then we have to start asking harder questions. The most important of those is not which consultancy worked on this, but who wrote the playbook they're all following. Because once you trace the threads back far enough, you find that the decisions shaping our games are not being made solely by the writers, the designers, or even the publishers. They're being made by organisations that exist entirely outside the creative process. Organisations that began with noble intentions but ended up wielding extraordinary influence over what games are allowed to be. It's not that developers have suddenly become worse storytellers or that players have become impossible to please. It's that the terms of creativity itself are now being dictated by ideological priorities that most people don't even know exist. The road to hell, as the saying goes, is paved with good intentions, and whether we realise it or not, those same intentions now underpin the foundations of modern gaming, a medium that once thrived on risk and rebellion, but is now increasingly governed by compliance. The question is no longer if that matters, but how much more we're willing to lose before we finally decide to take that road back. And remember, gaming doesn't have to be a luxury hobby reserved for those with bottomless wallets. Through this channel, you can grab 38% off the critically acclaimed Silent Hill F, 30% off Borderlands 4, and huge savings on titles like Stellar Blade, Final Fantasy Tactics, Black Myth Wukong, and countless more. Use my links below to unlock discounts on thousands of games, or if you are sick of modern gaming altogether, don't forget that I have made brand new videos on both the Sega Saturn and the 3DO over on my new channel, Lady Arcade. But if that's still not enough options for you, you can access my behind the scenes cosplay library and more by becoming a backer over on Patreon. See you next time.